There is one fundamental thing that changed the way I paint portraits. This one thing not only made painting easier for me, but also allowed me to paint quicker. And this thing is using a limited palette. I'm going to be discussing this palette, why I use it, and as well as its benefits. So I'm going to be doing a painting of this sculpture here on the left, and I've started off by first laying down a warm red tone for the ground, and then I'll start by laying in a middle tone value for the head. Now for this painting I've used a limited palette, and this palette is famously known as the Zorn palette. The Zorn palette consists of just 4 colors: white, yellow ochre, red and black. Now this palette was made famous by the Swedish artist Anders Zorn. In some of his self-portraits we can see him holding a palette with these 4 colors. Now many artists before him utilized versions of this color palette, and this is because way back when there was not this wide range of colors that we have today. Artists had to make do with what they had. But anyway, I came across this palette after realizing that it was just these colors that I needed to paint portraits and figures. I'm sure we all first had those sets of paints that came with 12 colors, and we would squeeze them all out onto a palette and paint with them. But I started to realize that there was, I guess, a common denominator whenever I painted a portrait, and that was using white, yellow, red, and a dark color. So after that I took this palette and ran with it, started to learn more about it, who used it, but most importantly, the why. And for me, there are 2 reasons: to focus on the fundamentals, being drawing and values, but also to work bolder and faster. Now, working faster doesn't mean rushing, and I think there's also quite a substantial difference between working fast and working bold. Artists like Sargent and Zorn didn't necessarily work quickly, because trust me, just because their brushwork seems quick and fast does not mean it was done so. A lot of calculating or analysis takes place before making such strokes. But anyway, personally, I want to work quickly, and this means trying to make the process as simple and as fluid as possible. Therefore, and this is so important, the start of a painting is the most important part. It lays down the foundation for the painting. Everything else after the blocking in of the head, for example, is just detailing, like adding the eyes or correcting the nose or the mouth. So to work quickly, we need to work large. As I like to say, working simple to complex. This palette also allows for, to a certain extent, less mixing, since there are a limited number of colors and a limited range of colors that we can mix. Obviously, it is impossible to mix vibrant blues or greens with such a palette, but for when painting skin tones, for example, these can be unnecessary. We're able to mix muted versions of these colors, which would be suitable for when painting skin. But back to the point, since there are less colors to use when mixing, this also allows us to get back to painting. And of course, what I'm referring to here is for traditional painting. With digital, we can simply color pick from the color block. But when wanting to use a palette like this, we would need to stay within this range. We're able to achieve a vibrant red like cadmium red, but also a yellow ochre. But it is important that you do not increase the yellow ochre saturation, since it is not heavily saturated like cad red. We can only increase its value, if that makes sense. And I hope I'm making sense. So it does take a bit of discipline to use this palette digitally. I started painting with very large shapes, and you can see these shapes or brush strokes become smaller and smaller. I've already blocked in majority of the key values, so now I'm just adjusting them, making some darks darker and the lights lighter. It's also important to paint zoomed out, so that you focus much more on what the reference and your painting looks like as a whole. It's all about the context. If you want to work quickly, another thing you can also put into place is to work with a time limit, like an hour or even 30 minutes. Of course, we would want to produce something convincing looking, so this time limit can force you to work with large strokes and to simplify the reference or model down much more. I use Krita when painting digitally. Such a brilliant piece of software that I find sometimes overlooked when being compared to other software like Photoshop. But trust me, it can do everything that Photoshop or even Procreate can do. I spent a very long time painting in a very refined and tight style. painting form by form. And I loved painting this way, but I also really wanted to paint looser and more expressive. And this was simply just a comfort problem. I wasn't used to painting this loose, and I felt like I needed to completely control the process, until I began to trust my drawing ability, being able to correct and fix shapes. Because when working with large and overlapping brushstrokes, we need to still be able to correct distances and measurements. That's what drawing is, simply measuring. And to paint like, for example, Sargent or Zorn, you need to be a very good draftsman. So, in my opinion, if you want to work quicker, you need to be utilizing a palette that is controllable, like a limited palette. We also need to work with as big a brush as possible and for as long as possible before tackling the so-called details, and also to work zoomed out or to step back constantly from the painting. This allows us to ignore the details and just focus on the shapes. But I'm gonna wrap it up here, and I hope you picked up a thing or two. But from me, there'll definitely be more to come. Stay in the paint.